Welcome back to another episode of Dungeon Hammer, brought to you by One Mind Syndicate. I am your host, Gersh1, and I'm here with my two co-hosts,
Docile Creature,
and the Sound Alchemist.
And today we're going to be teaching you how to make the best dungeon in Dungeons and Dragons. Ironically, I don't think I've ever been with a DM that has run a dungeon for me.
No, we've been in dungeons.
We've been in... Really?
Yeah.
When?
The first ever session we did. Remember, we were in a dungeon
we were in hell.
Near the end of it?
Oh, yeah.
Which I guess is something we should talk about. Dungeons don't have to mean underground stone, caverns.
But we were in one of those, too.
We were, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how would you describe a dungeon, then?
Just like a
series of rooms that has an endpoint that you got to complete certain
that has a
obstacles.
story. That kind of monsters,
right.
treasure.
Because a dungeon, like you said, doesn't have to be that. It could be a temple. It could be...
Yeah, I did a lighthouse that was a dungeon one time.
So would you guys say that, what are the requirements, or what are these, what is the difference between that and having, like, just a regular town and not calling a town a dungeon?
I think you have to have a confines. Like, the party can't normally or naturally get out of a dungeon, so to speak.
So would you guys consider, because based on that description, the book with the vampire dude Strahd.
Yeah.
What is that book
Curse
called?
of Strahd.
Yeah, Curse of Strahd. You're basically confined into a town because of a fog around it. Would you consider that town a dungeon then?
I feel like his castle would be more dungeon-like than the town.
Okay. So then confine like a very like solid boundary. Then you're saying that's what would constitute for a dungeon.
A town, I feel like there's not much.
So there's a start and a finish.
Yes.
Whereas like a town is like, well, I can
open-ended.
just like, yeah, it's open-ended.
But on the reverse of that, there can be a town in a dungeon.
True.
And that could be like a room, and so it can be kind of a dungeon.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty fluid definition, I'd say.
Yeah.
It's not like this is what a dungeon is.
How would you prep a dungeon? Because it seems like old D&D, from like the videos that I've seen, it used to be like, okay, you're in front of a dungeon, what do you do? Whereas now it seems like there has to be more foreplay. Whereas like, how do you lead up to a dungeon? So before we tell you guys how to create the best dungeon, let's tell you how to foreplay. What's your tongue technique?
I guess it depends on how your players are going to interact with the dungeon. If it's more stereotypical, like they're going in there for treasure, then maybe build up some lore that they hear about in the dungeon. That gives them hints about what they might find inside, or lore about the big treasure at the end that's going to motivate them to be like, okay, this is rough, but we got to get that 1,000,000 gold at the end of this thing.
I like that idea, like planting seeds. The best dungeon has seeds planted for it before it even begins. It kind of has notoriety before you even get into it.
Think about like Indiana Jones or something like that. Like he went there with a purpose to get whatever, and so he braved the dangers of this dungeon to get
the Holy Grail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Jesus.
The easiest way to just have a dungeon gain notoriety would just be like, oh, you go to a tavern and it's on the what do you call it? Like the board.
The board?
Yeah.
Message board.
Yeah, there's a dungeon that needs to be cleared. There's something in there. There's somebody lost in it.
Mm-hmm.
Or somebody hires you to get this thing for them, or something like that.
Because Dungeons and Dragons is supposed to, as a DM, you're supposed to really like over embellish your players' role within the world. Obviously, they're supposed to be the heroes. Do you think that there should be an element to the best dungeon being like more deadlier than other dungeons? Do you think like when you're planting these seeds, you should try to say like, well, this dungeon, there's rumors that like a dragon lives inside this dungeon, or things like that?
Or you could have like a certain hero that you know from like a previous campaign or something, saying that he went into this dungeon and he never returned.
Was never seen again.
Yeah.
So while you're like prepping your party, like session 1, session 2, you're kind of just moving your fingers, kind of fingering, getting everybody warmed up.
Mm-hmm.
So after that's ready, how do you guys?
Well, hopefully by that point the dungeon is like dripping wet and there's like
ooze coming out.
Oh God.
Hopefully not ooze. Oh man,
Oh,
ooze.
we need to talk.
Yeah, if there's ooze coming out, please go to your nearest physician.
Brave the corona for that. 'cause
Yeah.
Something else is.
I thought of Ivan Ooze from the Power Rangers.
Yes.
And you do not want
that purple goop
Yeah.
hypnotizes all the adults to jump off cliffs or whatever they're gonna do.
Yeah.
It hypnotized me to dive deep.
Oh God.
Oh man.
So then, what are some criteria for you to like reach the dungeon?
So I think just getting to the dungeon, you have to create like an aura or an atmosphere.
Yeah.
You have to get like, you have to brave the deserts or go through like fog and
Or a
that's-
thick jungle or something like that.
to get to it. Because that's half the point is getting to your
Yeah.
destination.
And I feel like we're talking about more of a stereotypical
Yeah.
dungeon. But a dungeon can also be like something that they didn't expect to be a dungeon.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Okay.
for example, the lighthouse that I ran, they went in there
Yeah.
expecting it to be a lighthouse, and it was much more complex than that. It can be like a surprise dungeon or something that doesn't have this build up to it. So it's not as grandiose, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But it's still a series of obstacles to overcome in a dungeon or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that is something that I think we should take some time to talk about because we've talked about it in other podcasts, especially when we were talking about like mystery or how to build a session. But how would you design a theme, or how would you design? Or what were you saying? Creating an atmosphere. How would you create the atmosphere towards the dungeon?
If I'm making a campaign focused on dungeons, the way I would do it is that these dungeons have been appearing randomly throughout the world, and somehow, some way, you found out that within each dungeon, you can become super rich. Like there's gold, there's weapons, there's stuff to entice people to do it. So that kind of makes everybody want to become an adventurer. And
Kind of like Vault Hunters in Borderlands.
exactly. So now
I've
everybody's
never played the game.
Yeah, so now everybody who wants to become rich or wants to get something out of, life besides working, it's like they're all becoming adventurers and they're trying to clear these dungeons.
Okay, you do hit on a big point too. I think that the best dungeon, a good dungeon, has a incentive,
Mm-hmm.
and that incentive, obviously, in your situation, was the
Gold, money, that stuff.
It could, but the incentive could be as basic as just survival.
Mm-hmm.
Like get out of here at a certain amount of time or a certain blah blah blah. Otherwise, you die.
okay,
Kind of like Aladdin.
yeah. Or if you touch something, the lions or
Because that
tigers.
you could say the whole thing to get like the genie's lamp was a dungeon, right?
Yeah.
Oh, definitely, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
It fits the requirements of an enclosed area with a certain amount of things.
Obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Things. You know.
Now, when you enter a dungeon, do you want to enter like with
Face
like,
first.
face first? Okay,
Well, my bad. Fingers first, and then face.
gotcha.
Lips.
So you want to kind of feel out the dungeon first before saying, "All right, we can do this."
Well, I think that's what makes it cool too about like as a DM introducing a dungeon to a party is you don't really know what the party's how they're gonna interact with your dungeon. Like, are they gonna like try to figure out the architecture first? Are they gonna try to see what walls are more oozing than others? Which ones make you purr? What
Should I
like
go
that.
deeper in the dungeon? Should I focus on the top of the dungeon?
That would be a
Right.
cool dungeon, like the inside of a massive beast.
Oh,
It's like climbing through its.
so it's like wet
inside.
and warm.
Yeah, slick.
Oh,
And sometimes when you rub the right spot, it goes.
that's the best dungeon right there.
That's like in Rick and Morty with the Jurassic. What is it? Like
Oh.
Jurassic Park, but inside somebody's body.
Yeah,
I didn't see that one apparently.
you're not big brained. You don't watch Rick and Morty.
No,
Dang, we don't take your opinions with heart anymore
Yeah.
that's all right.
because we all know you have to be smart to watch Rick and Morty.
Yeah.
But it does seem like every dungeon, like even when I think of like The Hobbit, like when they were about to enter the mountain, they didn't just enter the mountain. There was a whole
Puzzle.
riddle.
Yeah.
There was a puzzle. So, and same thing with Lord of the Rings when they were going to enter the same thing, right? The dungeons of Moria.
Mines of Moria.
Yeah, there you go. There's a riddle So like even prepping your team with a certain puzzle or riddle to get into this dungeon kind of raises that prestige of the dungeon that you're getting into.
It sets an expectation of what to expect.
Right.
Yeah.
Should your dungeon be free flowing from room to room? Like, for example, if you go into a dungeon and you come into this room where you have like goblins in it, should you make that room kind of be its own entity, and then as you go into another room, it's like, oh, well, it looks completely different, and now there's something else, or should you kind of make it all thematic?
I think it's a theme, right?
Yeah, that's what. I think traditionally, like, it was more random like that, but I really don't like that personally. This could be a personal thing, but I think the whole dungeon should have some sort of theme, both within its aesthetic, with the monsters that are there. It should all kind of make sense, so you're not fighting goblins in one room and manticores in another, and this. So, because it feels more gamey that way.
Yeah.
When you step into a room, oh, what monster am I going to fight this time? And it's just like you roll on the table
Right.
and basically pick a random monster to fight. It should have some sort of like aquatic theme or like fire theme or something like that, so that kind of connects the whole dungeon and it makes it more realistic and more like makes sense in the world.
Yeah, that's a key point, making it feel realistic, and you have a lot of helpful hints, specifically in like the books that they've created for D&D. I wanted to call them codex for some reason, but like in Volo's guide, it goes through each individual monster's lair, and the theme to those makes it feel like each layer is supposed to be a living, breathing entity all in its own. So like, where do the kobolds gather? Where do they pray? Where do they, like, things like that. So as you're going from room to room, you kind of like, okay, this is the witch's garage, this is the witch's kitchen, things like that.
So it's not just like, oh, I'm just fighting in a dungeon. It's like, no, this is somebody's house.
Yeah,
like
the rooms make
lives here.
sense. They're
Yeah.
not just there for the sake of being a dungeon room.
Right. And then on top of that, you also want to tell a story. And I think The Lord of the Rings did a really good job of doing that they went into a room and they saw this was the dwarves' last stand.
Yep.
They found that little book with the guy, and it basically told them like, yeah, this was the last of the or the dwarf resistance from the orcs, and this is where they made their final stand. So building a narrative while you're going room to room is another cool thing that you need to
maybe you
incorporate.
find the long lost hero that never came out of there alive, either alive or dead or something like that, or hints that he was in this area, and then by the end of the dungeon you find a corpse or whatever.
Yeah. And then another big important part of creating a good dungeon is obviously creating something to fight. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like like one bad person or like a group of like goblins and stuff like that. But there has to be some type of challenge within the dungeon. And there's many ways to do that, from puzzles to like even trying to negotiate. Kind of like what the docile creature was saying. Like you're trying to negotiate through a town.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think the best dungeons have all of that.
Yeah.
They have combat encounters, they have puzzles, they have traps, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
At what point should you be introducing these things? Because obviously you don't want to like have all these traps in the beginning of the dungeon where your party is now like below half HP and finally you get to the big bad. Or is that maybe what you want to do?
That's kind of the point of a dungeon, is to deplete your players' resources so that by the time they get to the end, they're like barely hanging on. And they have to kind of like figure out what they're going to do to hold their spell slots or their arrows or something like that, so that by the end of this thing, they have something to fight with. Or
do you think the fight should always be the last thing?
No, it doesn't. Well, probably. I mean, because I think a dungeon
like you've just hit the cervix. Like you're ready for a fight, right?
Yeah.
You're going to go right through that.
You fought through all the goop and the
slime, the ooze.
The ooze, yeah. I think this might be obvious, but the dungeons should escalate in difficulty the closer you get to the end, both with the traps and the puzzles and the fights.
Unless you go in like not through the front door.
Yeah, and I think if your players do manage to find out how to do that, like don't be like, oh crap, I planned a whole dungeon. I'm gonna change things up. Let them sneak through the back door and get to
It
the
usually
big
never
boss.
ends well though. If you try to sneak in through the back door, it's like, whoa.
Yeah, you should probably.
Without letting them know.
You gotta
Yeah.
ask the back door first. But
Right.
Or at least warm it up first.
yeah.
Lick it a little bit. But the thing about doing what the docile creature did is, like, if you're a DM and your party figured out a way, like a back door to it, let them know that they found a back door somehow, some way. Because sometimes they might just like go in there and they're like, oh, and the boss is already here. Like, that's kind of lame.
Shortest dungeon ever.
Yeah, yeah. But letting them know, like, oh no, you guys broke through a bunch of like barriers that I didn't even think you guys could do, or that you guys could break through, but you guys figured out a way to
But
enter.
going into the boss first might be also a good thing, because let's say now they can't go back the way they came, so now they got to traverse the dungeon backwards.
Yeah. So like they kill the big bad guy, but now they have to go through all your little.
The underlings, the traps, the puzzles,
Mm-hmm.
after having maybe even barely survived it.
Yeah, yeah.
Hauling all the treasure.
Right. It's like you thought, okay, we're here at the end. Let's just blow our load right away,
Yep.
kill them real quick, and then just leave. And it's like, oh well, I use all my spell slots, all my potions. Like, how am I gonna survive the rest of this?
Yep.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I also think that every good dungeon should have something good to loot.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you're going through all the effort of doing it. It's like, give them something worthwhile,
Mm-hmm.
a genie lamp.
And it shouldn't be just towards the end. I
Yeah.
think you should reward exploration of your dungeon.
All throughout, you're
Yeah.
getting loot the whole time.
Especially like you were saying, like you find the hero's corpse. It's like obviously the hero has some pretty good loot.
Yeah.
He didn't become the hero for no reason.
Yeah.
I think one of the coolest things too is leaving mystery within your dungeon. So I remember going into a dungeon once that the very first DM that we ever had, or that I ever had, did. I walked into a lake and he asked me, like, do you want to check what's in the lake? And I said, like, no, because he gave me a look like, if you check what's in the lake, then something bad's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I said no, and I walked away. But to this day, I still think back, I'm like, what was in that lake?
Yeah.
What did he prepare for me in that lake? So leaving mystery or creating mystery within a dungeon is really important too.
And also, kind of along that same lines, don't make the dungeon linear, like completely linear, where they go from one room to one room to one room. Make branches that go off in other directions where they can explore other areas, find other loot, other mysteries, so that if they don't fully clear a dungeon, there's stuff in that dungeon that they might be able to come back and explore further, or if they want to be completionists, they go throughout the whole dungeon and learn all the secrets, and have things in certain wings of the dungeon that they would only discover or only get if they went to this dungeon, this side quest inside of the dungeon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And make sure to write that stuff down too, because it is easy to forget and be like, sometimes your players will remember something that you don't, and then they'll say like, oh, we're back in this dungeon, remember how you said, and then you're like, oh shit, now you have to like scramble to see like what was hidden behind that room.
Mm-hmm.
So just make sure to have a little notepad next to you when your party's in a dungeon.
When
Yeah.
you're designing a dungeon, should you almost make it like a board game, but with multiple layers, is what you're saying?
I always have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's. I find it easier if I have some sort of visual reference. I usually like draw a map out or
The grid system.
that only I look at that says like I letter all the rooms and this is what's in each room. Have a key, like this is what's in each room. The monsters, treasure, secrets, traps, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found, because initially, the very first time I ran a dungeon, I ran it with you two, and I actually had each room like sealed behind like a little piece of paper. So like every time you guys would walk in, I would reveal it.
That was really cool.
That was real cool. Like it's essentially like sticky notes on top of the actual map.
Yeah, but it's not necessary. I think I have learned now that like I could just describe, like, okay, so you have two ways to go through.
Mm-hmm.
Well, which way do you guys want to take? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical thing, especially if you're doing theater of mind. Like it doesn't have to be a physical thing on the board in front of you, where you're covering, but it should be like you should have an understanding of what each room is.
Yeah.
Right.
Or a map layout, I
Mhm.
guess I should say.
It could be a fun thing for your players to do to like
Remember,
draw a map
yeah.
as they go, so that they have some.
I was about to say that.
Yeah.
It's like, at what point do you like, oh, they've gotten so deep into it, I'm never gonna remember like what 3 rooms back was, or
Yeah.
yeah.
Definitely make a key.
Unless they're playing the Minotaur.
Yeah,
Then you
never
can't
get lost.
Yeah.
right? Then that's when you kill the Minotaur.
Yeah, screw over the whole rest of the party. They're like, oh, we got a Minotaur. We don't got to draw a map.
That also comes to a different thing. When you're making traps and stuff, is it randomized, or do you say like, okay, obviously the Minotaur is going to be the threat here. Do I purposefully lead him into a room and then shut the stone door behind him?
I think that having the main boss should never be randomized. You should kind of know who the main boss is, but the rest of the bad guys in a dungeon don't necessarily have to be thought by you. You could actually, there are a lot of resources within the dungeon masters or the DM guide, and then there's also some in like Vol's guide that actually it's just charts that you roll on.
Yeah, I think that as long like I said before, as long as you stay on theme. I wouldn't want random like completely from other, like a sphinx in this room and a demon in this room, but as long as it makes sense somehow, that they don't have to fit the exact same theme just on the surface.
But what if they never actually get to figuring out why it makes sense? Then to them it would never make sense.
Yeah, that is true.
They didn't do their job as explorers. As a DM, you did your job and you fleshed out this dungeon to the best of your ability. Doesn't mean that the players are gonna.
But maybe you leave like little inklings as to why.
Yeah, you'd want to give clues for sure.
Never just completely not explain something that makes no sense.
Unless you're never going to be with that group again. Right? Like,
but then it'll be like your case. You'll never know what was in the lake.
Yeah, and it's annoying to like
Exactly.
think about that.
So then that's when.
But
what if he said, as you were walking out of the lake, you felt something brush up on your foot?
But the good thing about dungeons is they're gonna be there. You
True.
can come back.
Unless they're like magical and like they could be unsummoned or summoned or
Sure.
whatever.
And I guess the other problem too is that like in the situation that the Sound Alchemist was bringing up, if you are so vague that they don't figure out exactly why the Sphinx was in that room, why, like, how do you bring that back and explain that? I guess.
You don't. I mean.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to have clues, more than one clue, and more places to find them, I guess. Have to make it more obvious. Maybe they don't specifically find out why there's a sphinx and a demon, but they find out later on that there's something else. And it's like, oh, why is this here? And why are those two things here?
Yeah.
They started grinding their gears to try to figure it out. Maybe they don't even care.
Right.
Would that kind of would that hurt your trust with the player? Kind of like the player would then start to believe like, oh, he just threw a sphinx at us because he didn't have because he turned to that page in the monster manual and that's what was there, and then you lose trust in the DM. So how much of that do you think it's your responsibility to be like, no, I'll give you a definite answer as to why I have the sphinx there?
I think.
I feel like that's the player's job.
Yeah.
Like, you put the dungeon there, it's their job to explore it. And if they just go one room or one path the whole way and then they walk the same path back and leave all this stuff unexplored, then, I mean, you can only do so much.
Right, because I think that's what happens when you have a dungeon. You don't necessarily have to explain it. It's a dungeon. But if you're in a different setting and you just throw a sphinx out there, then that requires more explanation.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that's just my opinion.
Yeah.
Because it's like, I mean, there's weird things in dungeons. Okay, whatever. But it's like, we're just walking outside and a sphinx come out of nowhere. It's like, well, why?
Yeah, I get you.
But still, having a more thematic dungeon is better, in my opinion. Like, it just flows better. There's more reason and intrigue from the party. Because if you go into a dungeon and everything's chaotic, you don't know what to expect. It's like, that gives a different sense of terror and intrigue. But if it's all thematic, I think that makes more sense narratively.
Okay, yeah. How much of a dungeon should be actual encounters, and how many rooms of just like ambiance should you create?
I don't think there should be any empty rooms.
Even
the
if a
dungeon.
room appears empty, there should be something
Yeah.
to it.
Like there should be a reason why this room's here. There should be something in this room, even if it's as simple as like one small little clue or a track or something like that. Saying, "Oh, your player, you go through a hallway, and then there's two little forks. I go to the right. There's a room. There's two doors. It's like, why did we have all that? We could have just connected this room to the next room with stuff in it, and not wasted our time describing rooms that were pointless.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Every room should have a purpose, even if it's a tiny one.
gotcha.
They don't necessarily have to be encounters or traps,
Yeah.
but make it a reason that you're describing this stone walkway.
Yeah. I created a dungeon once with you guys, and I had that mentality of like make every single room count.
Mm-hmm.
And then you guys got to the point where your resources were depleted, probably because you guys were first level. And then,
Yep.
and then I was just like, okay.
And we had just fought a roper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it was a situation of like, oh, these guys are going to want to continue, but they're probably going to die next room. But then one of you guys were like, well, maybe we should rest.
Mm-hmm.
So I think as a DM, it is very rewarding to see your players be like, yo, we need a rest.
Yeah.
Like, this has been like taxing on our resources.
Yep.
So yeah, a good dungeon does that. A good
Also,
dungeon is,
keep in mind, this is a
Yeah.
mistake that I made that I just regretted so much. I was early on that same lighthouse dungeon. I was like so impressed with this dungeon. I made a blueprint. I like put all these rooms. I was like, oh, this is gonna be so cool. And in the moment, I depleted their resources, and then they took a long rest. It's like, okay, I depleted the resources. They took a long rest, and then later on, I'm like, why did I let them take long rests? That many long rests doesn't make any sense. They wouldn't sleep all that time in the day. Oh, it ruined the whole dungeon for me. Because it would, by the time they got to the end, their resources would have been gone. But they were like, "Oh, we're just going to take a long rest," and they were up to full. So just make sure your players aren't recuperating their resources too often, I guess.
how would you combat that?
Well, you can't take 8 hours of sleep every 3 hours, basically, or every hour.
But
Every couple rooms are like, "All right, time to take an 8-hour rest." It's like, I think there's a rule in the monster or in the DM's guide that says you can't take a long rest more than once a day.
Oh, okay. If there's a rule for it, yeah.
I think there is, yeah.
Because I would like the argument is that like, no, I'm tired. I'm just gonna sit here. Even if I don't sleep, I'm just gonna sit here and wait until I can sleep because I just got mauled by a.
I think
Oh,
the
yeah.
definition of a long rest is like
Minimal.
actual sleep.
Oh,
Like
is it?
you're not just sitting around doing nothing. It doesn't all have to be sleep, I think. I don't
Isn't
know.
it like just
Don't quote me
minor
on that.
activity?
For certain races, but some races actually have to like boot down and
Boot down.
sleep.
Yeah.
Because another thing I've seen is like sometimes a DM would throw like during a long rest they'll throw like a challenge at us
Mhm.
that wakes us up and then it's like, well, no, you didn't get that long rest because actually that chupacabra attacked you
Yeah.
during the night, sucked you off, and now what are you gonna do?
Yeah. Turns out I'm a goat.
A were-goat.
Yeah.
I want to be a were-goat. That sounds badass.
Badass. Oh my.
You guys are on the same page.
We're
You
all-
guys are following the theme of your own dungeons in your mind.
That's
right.
true.
Suck dick.
Whoa. Now, how would you combat somebody, like, for example, on your lighthouse dungeon, if they just exited the lighthouse and climbed it from the outside all the way to the top?
Well, the way that I kind of got around that is the lighthouse was submerged underwater, and so they had to come in through the top.
Why didn't they just swim down?
I think they tried,
Oh.
but it was
But-
pretty tall, and they can't breathe. None of their races could just breathe underwater.
Oh,
so,
okay.
they
But
went through the
that's
top.
where you said like your improv skills need to come into play.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, nope. There's a fog that actually depletes your
Right.
juice.
Yeah, it gives you exhaustion points.
Yeah. Well, that's actually from the book.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's what the book said.
So blame the book. Not
Yeah,
him.
blame the book.
Fucking book.
Now, the ratio between traps, puzzles, and actual, like, monster encounters, what do you think that should be at? To be something pretty, I'd say, even for the group? Like, if you have, like, that murder hobo in there, if you have somebody who likes to role plays and solve things, what would be, like, a good, like, ratio?
Well, I guess you would break it down into what type of players there are, right? Because there's like the murder hobo. There is the role playing person, and what else is there? Like honestly,
People who likes
Explorers.
riddles? I don't know.
I mean, you do. Yeah, you have to kind of. But at the same time, you got to think. Sorry, combat takes a long time, and puzzles can take a long time
Sometimes,
depending
yeah.
on.
Mm-hmm.
But traps usually don't take that long.
If you have stupid friends.
Yeah, so it depends on
What's
how
1 + 1?
how long you want to be in the dungeon. Like, I don't think you should have a bunch of puzzles because that can kind of get boring or that can get old.
Yeah, because if they can't solve it after like 4 minutes, and it's just like,
And then like the next room there's another one, and like
Yeah.
a few rooms later there's another one. And if you do, they have to be different, so you're not just kind of treading the same mental exercises.
2 + 2.
Yeah.
We barely did the first one.
But that does bring up a good point. You shouldn't have a solution, like a definite solution to an encounter. So, like, if you do have a band of trolls that are in one room protecting that
What
room-
genre?
Huh?
What genre?
Genre of what?
Band.
A band
Are they a
of
metal
trolls.
band? Or?
Oh, that's a very, like, Sound Alchemist type of joke.
I was thinking
not
of
prepared.
trolls from like the movie Trolls.
Yeah, thank you, Sound Alchemist.
And they're all the different genre of music.
They are
so
the newest movie.
I don't watch that stuff.
it doesn't come out yet. None of us.
It is. It is out. They didn't release it theatrically, but it's out on digital.
Wow.
Disney Plus.
No, it's. I think you have to purchase it.
They did that with another Disney Plus movie that was like pretty good. The one where it was actually D&D based. It was the one with their.
Onward.
Yeah, Onward.
Yep.
I watched it.
I saw it too.
Yeah, it's
I should watch it.
It's really good.
I think you'd like it.
Yeah.
If it's D&D
They
based.
die at the end, but you would like it.
Yeah.
I don't want to watch it anymore.
What was I saying before this?
What genre of trolls?
Oh, so like let's say it's a like
Smooth
LA
jazz.
like a school like old school LA like rap.
Okay.
So like Cypress Hill type of
Okay.
genre.
Okay.
Genre.
Genre.
Genre. I just tuned into your character for a second.
Genre.
So let's say you have that, and like make sure that there's different ways of solving it. It doesn't necessarily have to be like I have to kill these trolls. It could be like I want to negotiate. Maybe there's something else in the dungeon that they want. Maybe they want a lucky egg, or like a picture of Bridget B.
Yeah.
I have that in my back pocket. Boom.
Boom.
I collected that on the way in.
Yeah, because it wouldn't make sense to have like a riddle inside of, like you were saying, like a beast. Like you were going inside of a beast, and that's
Yeah.
the dungeon. Why is there a riddle in here?
Yeah. That wouldn't
Like-
make sense.
I mean, to be honest, don't we have to solve some type of riddle to get into the deep? Like, we really do.
That's more of a physical puzzle, not a riddle.
Oh,
They're gonna like say any magic. Well, I mean, you kind of
could,
have to say
yeah.
magic words.
Mhm.
Oh man,
so maybe that is the ultimate
an organic riddle. Yeah.
Yeah.
The ultimate riddle.
That's everything.
Or the ultimate dungeon.
It's a physical puzzle. It's a mental puzzle.
Yeah.
It's a charismatic puzzle.
So I guess we should just take hints from like real life.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Just have your D&D session. Just try to get with the girl in the D&D.
But back to a serious point. I mean, there could be also other creatures that have inhabited the inside of this giant creature and put puzzles there.
Why are you
And
gonna
traps
put
and
that
stuff
in
like
my
that.
head? Now I gotta think of.
What other creatures have been in there?
Bunch of kobolds just run a train.
Fucked up.
They put tracks in there.
Yeah, and they set up their homes in there. Oh man.
That's weird
Yeah.
to think of that in real life.
Mm-hmm.
Um.
Are you guys still with us? Or is this all one big inside joke where none of you guys even know what we're talking about?
Yeah, probably.
Oh yeah, dungeons. That is half of D&D, and
Yeah.
as big as dungeons are in D&D, I feel like we usually don't play in dungeons.
Right. I feel the same way. And I think that I feel that way is because of what we were saying back to like the whole resting period. There's so much in between time between interactions, whereas a dungeon is just nonstop. Like what's in the next room? What's in the next room? What's in the next room?
Right.
And I feel like a dungeon is a commitment
Yeah,
that
it is.
you don't want too much of, because
Yeah.
then it'll feel like just you're playing a dungeon crawl game, which isn't a bad thing, but might not be what you're going for.
Right.
Because
Has
you have
it-
to like sit down and plus it's a lot to prepare for a DM as well.
Mm-hmm. Have all these different encounters, riddles, traps, and at the same
Treasures
time,
and
yeah, trying to come up with a big bad at the end of everything, and it's weird because like when you think Dungeons and Dragons, you never actually think of a dragon at the end of a dungeon.
Yeah.
Uh,
Or
I
you?
do. Yeah.
Like I'm gonna play D&D. I'm ready to go into a dungeon and fight a dragon today.
At the end of it, yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, maybe that was my flaw. I think because it was such a heavy trope that
Mhm.
most DMs are gonna like push away from that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it is that concept though that will get you to the best dungeon. An enemy to fight at the end, something to loot inside, and a good reason why. And that reason is the theme. Like,
Mhm.
what is the overall theme of what the dungeon is all about? Like, why are you in there? What's in there? Things like that.
Yep.
Yeah.
The who, what, where, when, why.
And I think that's if you're completely stuck is let's say you're the first time being a DM, you're completely stuck on the narrative and what to do. A dungeon is probably the easiest thing you could do.
Gives you some time to.
Flesh out the rest of the world. Just be like, hey, you're all travelers. You all came to clear this dungeon. Let's go from here.
Yeah.
And those are our tips to creating a good dungeon. If you guys have any more, please let us know in the comment section below. We're probably going to expand on this idea because there's so many encounters that we can just branch off of. But then that goes for you guys then, if you guys have any suggestions for any topics.
A dungeon full of everything's a mimic.
Yeah.
Every door is a mimic. Every chest you think is your reward. Nope, it's a mimic.
We fought against the mimic and it wasn't that much fun.
But when everything could be a mimic, that's when you start to second guess everything.
Oh, see, you should have been a DM for that session.
No.
All right.
Let us know what you guys think down below.
Yeah, with that said, this was Gersh1.
Docile creature.
And the Sound Alchemist, and we are out of here.
Always used to put my freedom first.